Shangguan Wan'er, a lament written on colored paper. Leaves start to fall on Lake Dongting. I long for you 1,000 miles away. The dew becomes heavy. The scented quilt feels cold. As the moon sets, the embroidered screen empties. I want to play a melody from down south and strive to seal a letter for you at the northern border. The letter has no other intent but to express the disappointment at living long apart. So, this is the third and last of Shangguan Wan'er's poems which we're going to comment. And each of the poems we've talked about is representative of a strain in Shangguan Wan'er's poetry. We saw the court poem in the presenting colored paper cat flowers, the typical courtly poem of commemoration and flattery of the imperial person and of happy celebration of festivities. We saw a landscape poem depicting one of the estates in which the aristocracy enjoyed their free time. This third poem is part of what we could call the boudoir poetry tradition. I think we've talked about this before in previous poems. During the Six Dynasties period, basically the 2 centuries before the Tang Dynasty, a very popular poetic genre was boudoir poetry. It's especially represented in an anthology from the early 6th century, perhaps. New Songs from a Jade Terrace, and the aegis of Emperor Liang Jianwendi, who was a short-lived and rather incompetent emperor, but he was a very good poet. Now, the New Songs of the Jade Terrace basically are poetry composed for and in a courtier world, and the special topic they like to dwell upon is secluded palace beauties, concubines, empresses, or women of aristocratic positions surrounded by luxurious objects who are pining away at the absence of their emperor or their lover. These poems they have this voyeuristic element of getting the reader within the secluded and private quarters of the imperial seraglio, and they make a juxtaposition that is also curious and interesting between the luxuriousness, the opulence of the boudoir materials, generally, like gold, silver, silk, implements and pieces of furniture, which is contrasted with the emotional frustration and longing, the sadness and coldness, or the emotional deadness of the protagonist, which is this beautiful woman usually depicted as herself a work of art, who is suffering emotional pain in the midst of so much luxury and beauty. So, as I said, this is a very, very popular genre during the Six Dynasties. It continued being produced later on, but in the early Tang it was, pretty common. What is most interesting, perhaps, of this piece is that it is written by a woman, which is not typically the case. These poems were written by men, and they were male fantasies. But here we have a distinctive, a real female voice playing this conventional topic of a woman's grief at parting. More specifically, the poem we've just read, from its context, harks back more to the Jue Fu even of the early period of this union, because the woman who is the poetic persona of the poem is not exactly a concubine or an empress or whatever. She is the wife of a person who is serving in the northern frontier. And again, this topic is perennial in Chinese poetry. A marriage that is separated and the husband is, fighting the wars. The woman is meant to be a southerner, and we see this from the first line, where she is close to Lake Dongting, which is one of the big lakes in the middle course of the Yangtze River Valley, and what for Tang Dynasty China would have been the south, even though there were other areas more to the south of the course of the Yangtze River Valley. So the poem adopts this grieving wife persona, and apparently unsophisticated style. Metrically, it's 8 lines of 5 syllables each, so it looks pretty much like a regulated poem, although I don't think it is. And the topics, there's one main topic, as I said, which is the pain and separation of a wife from her lover, and the emotional distress the woman feels amidst her southern context and the relative opulence of her surroundings. As usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. So first couplet, leaves start to fall on Lake Dongting. I long for you 1,000 miles away. So the poem is, the first couplet is, as usual, is pretty straightforward, especially the second line clearly states what the poem is about. I long for you 1,000 miles away. The woman is separated from her lover, and we're already given in the first line the probable location of the woman. So leaves start to fall on Lake Dongting. So this is probably autumn. Leaves are falling. Autumn leaves, perennial Chinese hackneyed image of the passing of the seasons, the passage of time, of sadness. Autumn is a sad season because it's the beginning of decline. References to Lake Dongting appear in tons of poems. Perhaps some of the oldest appear in Chu Yuan's poetry, for example, in Lady of the Xiang River. We also get autumn whispers, waves of the Dongting Lake, and leaves falling around. So, pretty conventional image. But from the context of the narrative of this poem, it locates the speaker as a southern woman living in the old area of the state of Chu, somewhere near Lake Dongting. Second couplet. The dew becomes heavy, the scented quilt feels cold. As the moon sets, the embroidered screen empties. So the second couplet harks back to a topic we've discussed in lots of poems in the 300 Tangs Poems anthology. The topic or the motif of wakefulness at night. Again, a very, very conventional topic in classical Chinese poetry. The poetic persona is unable to sleep and so spends the whole night awake, pining, longing, looking at the moon, strumming some musical instruments, turning around in the bed. This wakefulness at night is usually because of romantic reasons, and it's clearly so in this case. Sometimes it's sort of for political reasons, or the romantic background is used as a cover for a political complaint. Heavy dew is associated with autumn. So it's autumn, so dew is now, falling heavily, not as lightly as it did in the summer. And that's the outward, but we very quickly get the zoom towards the inward. So the scented quilt feels cold. The woman is under a quilt, perfumed quilt, but she feels the cold of the season and the cold of her loneliness. The moon is setting. Well, that indicates that she's been spending the whole night awake, enough to see the moon come out, and now the moon set down. And as the moon sets, the embroidered screen empties. We might imagine that she has a screen in front of her bed with images that she might have been looking at. But now, as the moon is setting, the little light that the moon was giving away is disappearing and the screen becomes invisible. Third couplet. Again, in Tang, not only Tang, many traditional Chinese poets, you get this sort of zoom in where the first couplets like depict the background and nature, and as we go on, we get a zoom in and we see individuals within a specific space, and we get to hear about the feelings of the individual. So we go from outer to inner. Same thing happens here. The first couplet gave us the vague geographic region at which we are. The second couplet locates us in a bedroom and describes mostly objective outer sense impressions. The third couplet directly states the feelings or restates the feelings of the poetic persona. Yeah? I want to play a melody from down south and strive to seal a letter for you at the northern border. So the third couplet is basically about the frustration of intent. We have this frustration of separation, but now we have also the frustration of intent. The poetic persona wants to do a couple of things and is unable to do either of them. The first one is play a melody from down south. This would have been Jiang Nan Chu, a melody from south, which was a type of juefu, of ancient ballad traditional poetry. The ballads from the south, as opposed to the ballads from the north, were generally short romantic poems. yeah, about the separation and protestations of love of separated lovers. Yeah. So she wants to sing, she wants to play that southern melody which so well matches her mood. But it's probably too sad and dejected to do it. And she strives to seal a letter to send to the northern border. This is the first indication, at least the first clear indication, not only the first one, the only one actually in the poem, that seems to indicate where her husband or her lover might be. So there's this convention of men serving in the Great Wall, serving in the northern frontiers, fighting for many years. So the fact that her husband is in the northern border means, he's an army man, an officer, probably because, she lives in relatively opulent quarters, so her husband is some sort of military officer serving in the frontiers in the north of China. So she would like to seal a letter for him, but she can't. She just can't get into the mood for it, or isn't able to push herself because of her loneliness to do this thing. And finally, the last couplet here actually recapitulates her sadness at separation, and it continues the idea from the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 from the 6th line of the letter. So why? What's about this letter that cannot be sealed? So the letter has no other intent but to express the disappointment at living long apart. This letter that I want to seal and can't get myself to do it, this letter just basically transmits the same information this whole poem has been transmitting. I am sad at our separation. So as I said, the poem seems pretty unsophisticated, pretty straightforward, and it's a good example, perhaps, of that sort of boudoir poetry that was so typical in the Six Dynasties. And again, shows the talents of Shangguan Wan'er. And that's all we have to say for today. The poem is a translation by Masha Kopzeva and Shue Bai for the Biographical Dictionary of Tang Dynasty Literati.